Hello and welcome to this training. The topic for this session is an introduction to Microsoft products and their licensing. My name is Simona and I'll be taking you through this training today. So this is what we'll be covering in this session. We'll be running through the key Microsoft technologies as listed here on the left-hand side, and we'll cover the basics of how they are licensed. And that means you'll be building up your knowledge of some different licensing models. For example, device licensing and server CAL licensing, etc. And this will enable you to put together a kind of shopping list, if you like, of the licenses needed for a particular solution, and then other training in this series will help you determine which program those licenses should be purchased through. Let's begin with client software, and by this I mean software that is used by end users like you and me. Here we have a client computer used by an end user. Now I'm going to get out my X-ray spectacles and look deep inside that client computer, because what I'm trying to show you here is for that computer to work it needs a base layer of technology. That's the operating system. And because this is a client computer, more specifically, we need a client operating system. And the name of Microsoft's client operating system is, of course, Windows. And the version current today is Windows 8.1. Now, Windows 8.1 comes in several different editions, but the only two which are available through volume licensing are Windows 8.1 Enterprise and Windows 8.1 Pro. Now, the Enterprise Edition does have some extra functionality when compared to Pro, but of course our focus today is on how they are licensed. So this takes us onto our very first licensing model, device licensing. And the text in the blue box here is absolutely key. A license must be assigned to each device on which the software is used. And I think the important word here is used, not installed. So although I've depicted the operating system as that green layer of technology on the computer as if it is locally installed on the client computer itself, if the organisation had chosen instead to deploy a virtual desktop infrastructure, then Windows 8.1 wouldn't actually be installed locally because it would be coming from a server. But from a licensing point of view, it doesn't matter. We just need a license for each device that is using Windows 8.1, and as we already know, that can be either Enterprise Edition or Pro. Now, I'm depicting these licenses in the training today as these little yellow documents, but of course, in real life, the licenses are all electronic. The trouble is, our end user can't actually get any work done with just a client operating system. He needs another layer of technology, some client applications shown in the yellow layer here. And by this I'm meaning those day-to-day applications such as Microsoft Outlook, Word, Excel, etc., which are most commonly brought together in a suite called Microsoft Office. Now, the latest version of Office is Office 2013, and there are two editions of Microsoft Office available through volume licensing. That's Office Professional Plus and Office Standard. One of the differences between them is the individual applications they contain. For example, Professional Plus includes Access and a couple of other applications which Standard doesn't. But of course, again, our focus today is on how these products are licensed. Office 2013, like Windows 8.1, is also licensed by device. So our end user here has got a second license assigned to his computer. Often at this stage, I get people pointing out some scenarios where Office doesn't appear to be licensed by device. And you're right, there are some exceptions to this rule. But for now, let's just stick with the idea that Office is licensed by device when purchased as a traditional volume license. One thing that you will learn as you progress through your licensing journey is that there are often exceptions to any rules that we try and create. Okay, let's move on from the client software now and move on to licensing software that's installed on the server machine, and we'll begin with the server operating system. Here's our end user with his device licenses for Windows and Office. Now, you'll be pleased to know he doesn't work all by himself. He does have colleagues, and here you can see them also with their Windows and Office device licenses. They all work together and they share files, send emails and share resources such as an internet connection, and to enable this we need a server. So what I'm trying to depict here is a simple client-server network, and our task now is to look at the software which is installed on the server itself. So if I grab those X-ray spectacles again and look deep inside that server, you will see that just like the client machine, we need that base layer of technology, an operating system, but this time, of course, it's a server operating system. The latest version of Microsoft's server operating system is called Windows Server 2012 R2, and it is available in two main editions which you'll come across in volume licensing. This product is a requirement before server applications can be installed. So look at the yellow layer in our diagram here. Those are the server applications which can only be installed once the server operating system is in place. And examples of server applications would include Exchange Server, SQL Server, SharePoint Server, etc. But we'll talk more about how those are licensed later. Hyper-V is included in Windows Server for server virtualization. So let's just take a small sidetrack here to check that you're happy with the idea of server virtualization. Now what you'll find is that businesses won't just need a single server application, they'll need several. And in theory, they could install them all on the same server. So that could be Exchange Server and SharePoint Server and Link Server, for example. But in reality, the IT professionals prefer to separate the server applications out onto separate physical servers because it makes it easier to manage. But this means we've got all these servers which are hardly being utilised, they're taking up floor space, they need to be cooled, etc. There has to be a better way. And that's where server virtualization comes in. Instead of those second and third physical servers, we can use Hyper-V to create virtual servers, which means that these server applications think they're running on separate servers, but actually they're running in a virtual environment on this one physical host. I've tried to depict that here with these little miniature servers representing the virtual servers. In fact, it would be more usual that the physical server wasn't running any applications itself, but just acting as a host to those virtual servers. And then finally on this slide, Windows Server 2012 R2 is licensed with a processor-based and CAL model. So let's have a look at that now. Here we have a slightly more complex client-server network with 3 servers in the middle of the slide and users with their machines, the clients, around the edge. Now the processor-based bit of this licensing model applies to the servers, and that means I have to get out my giant magnifying glass to see how many processors the servers have, because the rule is that for every 2 processors in the server, a Windows Server processor-based license is required. So this next machine has got 4 processors, which therefore needs 2 licenses, and the same with the third machine. The other half of this licensing model is the CAL bit, and CAL stands for Client Access License. A CAL allows a client to access the server and can be assigned to the users or to the devices. So if the users in this organisation tend to use multiple devices, then a user CAL would be good advice. But alternatively, if the users share machines, then device CALs would be a good recommendation. So here's the summary. Processor-based and CAL licensing. Windows Server 2012 R2 is licensed with 1 processor-based license for every 2 processors in the server and CALs for users or devices. And I must also just point out that this model applies only to the standard and data center editions of Windows Server 2012 R2. We already talked a little bit about the idea of virtualization with our Windows Server summary slide, so let's look a little bit more at that now. The first thing to be aware of is that there are many benefits of virtualization, but reducing the number of licenses required is not one of them. Also be aware that virtualization rights are product, version and edition specific. So we're just going to do an example of Windows Server 2012 R2 here. You can't necessarily apply what we learn on this slide to other products. So let's have a look at the virtualization rights for Windows Server 2012 R2. We already know that a Windows Server 2012 R2 processor-based license covers up to 2 processors in the server. So this machine here needs 2 licenses. But if these licenses are standard edition, the rule is that 2 virtual machines are allowed per license. And I've depicted that here with these tiny transparent servers. For the data center edition, once the physical machine has been licensed, unlimited virtual machines are allowed. And that is the only difference between the two editions of Windows Server 2012 R2, the virtualization rights. I've already referred to some of these server applications in passing, but let's look in more detail about how some of these are licensed now. Here's our end user again, connected to the server, and here's a snippet of an Outlook email. Now, Outlook is the client application, and you can think of that as being installed in the yellow layer on our end user's computer, but we need something else on the server to actually send that email to the recipient. That something else is a product called Microsoft Exchange Server, so let's have a look at that now. In summary, Microsoft Exchange Server is the email server application to manage enterprise-wide email, and it provides users with 4 ways to access their information. We'll see this on the next slide. It can be installed in either the physical or the virtual environment, and it's licensed with a server and CAL licensing model. More on that in a moment too. These are the 4 ways that a user can access their email, calendar, contacts and tasks. Top left is the obvious one, that's the Microsoft Outlook client itself. And I'm sure many of you have used the Outlook web app shown here on the top right. But users can also access their information from a mobile device. You might have done that yourself, and that can be from a variety of different devices such as a Windows phone or an iPhone or an iPad or an Android device, etc. And then lastly, at the bottom right, voice access. That's where the user can telephone the Exchange server and actually interact with it using their voice. Normally, we wouldn't worry too much about the detail of what the technology actually does in licensing training, but this is an occasion where the functionality that the users require does actually dictate what licenses are needed. I already mentioned briefly in the summary that Exchange Server is licensed with a server and CAL licensing model, so let's look at that in a bit more detail now. You can see the 3 servers in the middle of my slide again and the clients around the edge, and the server bit of the server and CAL model simply means that we need a license for every server with Exchange installed on it. And as we saw before, the CAL bit stands for Client Access License, and these can be assigned to either users or to devices. But Exchange Server has got its own special twist on the server and CAL licensing model. In actual fact, if the users need to access just most of the functionality of the Exchange Server, depicted here by the blue shading, then they need what we call standard Exchange CALs. If they need all of the rest of the functionality, depicted by the red shading, then they need enterprise CALs in addition to those underlying standard CALs. The enterprise CALs can't stand alone, they have to be added onto the standard CALs. So there's the summary at the bottom of this slide, but you can see now why we needed to remind ourselves of the functionality of Exchange Server. So let's take a look at what extra functionality the users get if they add on those enterprise CALs. You can see here that the blue shaded standard CAL licenses the user to access their information from the Outlook client, the web app and mobile devices. When we add on the red shaded enterprise CAL, that licenses the user for the voice access bit as well as the ability to receive voicemails in their inbox. And the enterprise CAL also provides access to antivirus and anti-spam and compliance tools as well. We're going to take a small sidetrack here to look at online services, but we'll be back to some other server applications after this. This is the story so far. Here's our end user with his Windows 8.1 and Office 2013 device licenses, and we've got a server running Windows Server and Exchange Server, and our end user has got CALs to access the services of those server products. But so far we have assumed that all of this is on premises, and by that I mean that the server software is installed on servers that the organisation has on their own premises. An alternative to this would be an online version of Exchange hosted on Microsoft servers in a data centre accessed by the internet. This would mean that the organisation wouldn't have to have Exchange Server installed on their own servers at all, so I've just clicked to get rid of the yellow layer on the server. They wouldn't need an Exchange Server license, and the end user would no longer need his Exchange Server CAL. What he would need, however, is an Exchange Online USL. A USL is a user subscription license, and it's required for each user who is accessing the online service. Online services are fast becoming a popular alternative to on-premises solutions, and in fact we'll see that many of the other server applications we look at do actually have online alternatives. Let's continue now with some other server applications. Here's our end user again, but this time he's sending an instant message, and he's using Link, the client application, to do that. But as with Outlook, Link can't work alone. There has to be something on the server to make it work, and that something is a product called Microsoft Link Server. In summary, Link Server is the server application which manages instant messaging, presence, so that's the coloured blobs which indicate whether a user is online or away, etc., web conferencing and telephony. It can be installed in either the physical or the virtual environment, and there's also Link Online available as an alternative to an on-premises deployment of Link Server. Now it says here that Link Server is licensed with the same model we already saw for Exchange Server, that's Server and Cal, but we're going to look at it in a bit more detail because it's actually a little bit different to that of Exchange Server. This is a similar diagram to the one we saw for Exchange Server, but this time of course it's showing the 4 key areas of Link functionality that I did mention on the previous slide. And similar to Exchange Server, the clients require different CALs depending on what functionality that they need, but this time there are actually 3 different CALs. For IM and Presence, the users simply need a standard CAL, shown by the blue graphic here. For conferencing, they need to add on the Enterprise CAL, so that's the red shaded license, and then for voice and telephony, they would add on the Plus CAL, that's the green shaded license. But note, you can add on either the Enterprise CAL or the Plus CAL to the standard CAL. You don't have to have all 3, unless of course the users need all of the functionality of Link Server. Right, on to our next server application shown by this screenshot here. This time our end user is using a company portal or intranet, and this is driven by a product called Microsoft SharePoint Server. Microsoft SharePoint Server is all about managing content, business processes, and helping people find and share information, be it across an intranet or an extranet or even a public-facing internet site. And as with the other server applications we've looked at in this session, it can be installed in either the physical or the virtual environment. There's also an online version available as an alternative to an on-premises deployment of SharePoint Server, and it's licensed with the Server and CAL licensing model. In fact, SharePoint's licensing is very similar to that of Microsoft Exchange Server. There are standard and enterprise CALs available, and you would choose to assign users or devices either just the standard CALs or both the standard and enterprise CALs, depending on the SharePoint functionality that's needed. This is the screenshot of the example intranet which we saw on the previous slide, which as we now know is driven by SharePoint Server, and I've depicted SharePoint Server as the server application in the yellow layer on our server diagram on the right hand side here. But this isn't strictly correct because in actual fact there's something else which needs to sit in between SharePoint Server and Windows Server, and that's a database. And Microsoft Server Database is SQL Server. So SQL Server is required by SharePoint Server as the underlying data store. So let's have a look at SQL Server now. Microsoft SQL Server is a server application which is a relational database, and as I've just said, it's an infrastructure requirement for some products such as SharePoint Server. It forms the heart of Microsoft's business intelligence solution, and like many of Microsoft products, comes in different editions. And as with the other server applications we've already looked at in this session, it can be installed in either the physical or the virtual environment, but with the licensing we see yet another new licensing model to learn about. Some of the editions of SQL Server are licensed with a Server and CAL model, and this really is straightforward Server and CAL, no standard and enterprise CALs to worry about with SQL Server. But some of the editions are licensed with a model that counts processor cores. Now we've already seen that Windows Server requires you to count processors, But this is different. With SQL Server 2014, you need to count cores. Luckily, however, we don't need to worry about anything more than that in this particular session. Lastly, in this session, let's just have a quick look at how Microsoft's management tools are licensed. Microsoft's management tools are aimed at the people who need to keep everything up and running, deploy updates, provision those virtual machines, manage backups, etc. And I'm talking, of course, about the IT department. So the management tools, System Center, are for them. So it says here, a comprehensive management platform that enables IT professionals to more easily and efficiently manage IT environments, including the server infrastructure and client devices. But how is it licensed? In the middle here, we've got what we would call the management server. That's the server that the IT pro is using to deploy updates or manage backups or to perform whatever management task he needs to do. And around the edge, you can see the individual client and server machines which are being managed by System Center. That management server in the middle doesn't actually need a license itself, because in fact the only things which need licenses are the things or endpoints which are being managed. So if those endpoints are client machines, as shown on the right-hand side of my slide, then they need client management licenses or client MLs. And if those endpoints being managed are server machines, then they need server management licenses, server MLs. Just another point here about the server MLs. One server ML covers up to 2 processes in the managed server. So these managed servers have got just 2 processors, so they're okay with just the one server ML, whereas this one has got 4 processors and so needs 2 server management licenses. I'm really hoping actually that this reminds you of the Windows Server licensing model which we covered near to the beginning of this session, because that also needed 1 processor-based license for every 2 processors. That concludes this training session. I hope you found it useful and I wish you the very best of luck when taking the associated online assessment. Thanks for listening and I look forward to talking to you again soon about Microsoft licensing.